All right, so this is the video lecture matching the slideshow on Hellenism, or the Hellenistic period, and I'm moving to the slide that says Macedonia. I'll explain where the term Hellenism comes from later on as we get to it. But on this slide, what we're looking at here is a new kingdom that's coming to power. What we've talked about when we've talked about the main Greek city-states, if you remember from your map, they're on the sort of bottom half of mainland Greece, right? The Peloponnesus and those areas around there. The very top half of Greece, the very top of the Aegean Sea, is much more mountainous, and those kingdoms tended to remain more traditional tribal structure. And the Greeks in the city-states to the south tended to look down on them as barbarians, even though they were also Greeks. One of those kingdoms, Macedonia, those northern kingdoms, their king Philip, he decides to turn his kingdom into a modern Greek city-state. He's seen how wealthy and influential they are and how advanced they are, and he decides, I'm going to be just like Athens and Thebes. So Philip brings in, from the city-states to the south, he brings in craftsmen to help build his capital, Pelis, into a true polis. He brings soldiers to teach his mountain fighters how to fight in the disciplined Greek phalanx. And he brings scholars and philosophers. Even Aristotle himself comes to Macedonia, nice big hefty paycheck, to teach the sons of various Macedonian nobles, and even Philip's son, who's named Alexander. So by bringing these scholars and soldiers and craftsmen, the Macedonian tribesmen, mountain tribesmen, learn how to be modern civilized Greeks. And what we get here, as his city-state sort of organizes and becomes more wealthy, and as his mountain tribesmen now learn how to fight properly as soldiers, there is actually a different way they fight. The Greeks' phalanx tended to, each soldier would have a spear and a shield. The Macedonians either basically dropped the shield entirely and go with a huge, long, two-handed pike. So these tough mountain men with their really long, 12-foot long or 16-foot long pikes, wielding those, are very, very offensive type of formation, so very difficult to deal with. And they find, Philip finds, with these tough mountain men with their spears, I can fight the other Greeks very well. And what he decides to do, after watching the Peloponnesian War that had happened before his time, and then watching Thebes and Sparta fight it out, and he's watching the Persians as a constant threat, Philip decides he's going to be the one. Now he's got his new city-state. I'm going to be the one of the Macedonians that I'm going to unify Greece under my control. See, we're doing it all over again, right? And then use a unified Greece to finally conquer Persia and defeat Persia. And so that's what he proceeds to do. He begins to invade the southern city-states in the pretty early on, and is quite successful. They defeat Thebes. Thebes has that pretty advanced army, which the Macedonians have sort of copied, by the way. They said, oh yeah, having smaller phalanxes rather than big giant ones, more maneuverable. They outfight the Thebans. They defeat the Athenians. And essentially the Spartans just decide, we're not going to take you on, we're too small now. And by 337 BC, The Corinthians surrender too. Remember, the Corinthians focus on trade, and they're like, these wars have been expensive and messing up our trade. We surrender. It's better to just surrender to Philip than get involved in more huge, expensive wars that disrupt trade. So by 337, after about 3 years of campaigning, Philip has conquered Greece. Partly they're tired of fighting, partly they don't want to fight, partly Sparta and Athens are much, much weaker than they used to be. Philip has this incredibly disciplined and tough army, and he's conquered Greece by 337. And he puts the Greek city-states under what's called the League of Corinth. That just happens to be where they sign the document. And we have the end of the independent Greek city-state under Philip. It's an important historical timeline, right? The Greeks had been city-states, very different cultures and politics and societies. Now, there is no such thing really as an independent city-state, right? You are part of Philip's, really, empire. So they've lost their independence. So we come to a new phase of Greek history. The city-states replaced by bigger political entities. So you may still be a citizen of, say, Athens, but you're also a citizen of, the Macedonian Empire. And that's going to expand citizenship in some ways. We'll take a look at that later. Philip now plans on using the Macedonian and Greek armies, the various armies of his subject states, which makes him very powerful, and he wants to attack Persia. We're going to just, once and for all, crush the Persian army, push them away from the Greeks, and be done with it with a fully unified army. However, he will be assassinated at a wedding. There's a lot of little family politics that have been going on. He's not a very pleasant man, and ticked off a lot of people, and he's assassinated in 336. And that passes on. I've got Demosthenes on here. He was an Athenian leader that tried to rally the resistance against Macedonia. He might be worth a look up. I like him because he did these really great speeches about citizenship and defending against the Macedonian threat. But not only did he do the speeches that we must fight, but when the time came to fight, Demosthenes actually, by the way, took up shield and armor and fought himself. He didn't just send the young men up to die. He fought himself. Philip treated him with a great deal of respect because this man stood by his principles and fought for them. He's an interesting figure. Let's go to the next slide, which is called Conquest. So Philip's son, Alexander, becomes the king. The city of Thebes will briefly try to revolt to get independence. Alexander will march down, crush their army. He's another military genius, and burn the city to the ground. He's going to scare everybody. No one revolts. Okay, no one rebels. That's what happens if you do. Your city's burned to the ground. And you'll note, by the way, that with Athens without its walls, and Sparta's been shrunken down to a small town, and now Thebes has been burned to the ground, right? There's 3 of our 4 original city-states now, politically powerless. Remember, Athens is still a very big, rich city, but all these 3 cities are, politically powerless. Alexander will then take the Macedonian army and the Greek allies and will proceed to conquer Persia. And it's not just pushing them once and for all away from the Greek territories around the Aegean, but he decides, I'm going for full conquest. And he will march around. As part of his conquest, by the way, my map's kind of cool. You got an outline of the United States over the Middle East to give you a sort of relative size of his empire. Part of the process, he will destroy the Phoenician ports. If you go way back to the very first things in this semester, the Phoenicians were the hot ports along the Mediterranean coast that connected Greece and the Mediterranean and the Middle East. They're gone. This is the end of the Phoenicians under Alexander. Their cities and ports are destroyed. They no longer are the main trading areas. He will go in and conquer Egypt. and then move inland and take over the core of the Persian Empire in modern Iraq and modern Iran, and even end up in what is now Afghanistan. His army will be invincible. He's a brilliant military leader, as well as this incredibly tough and capable Macedonian army, as well as the Greek hoplites. They are unstoppable and conquer Persia. So what a turnaround from Persia constantly encroaching on the Greeks to the Greeks, well, you're gone, done, we've conquered you. Alexander will die without an heir, and he will die in 323, possibly from malaria, but dead and no heirs. And here's the problem, no one to inherit. And what do you do with a conquered Persian empire? Smattering of Greeks around Persia. The only main influence he had done is, as he had marched around, he had founded towns to govern the different parts of the Persian Empire, and he would settle either retired soldiers and as well as bring in colonists into these towns, and they would be the sort of Greek, little tiny Greek oases, if you like, in a sea of the Middle Eastern, and they were the areas from which he would rule, but they were just starting them up. But the most important town, and by the way, almost all of them, he calls Alexandria. There's like 70 of them. And he calls them all after himself, Alexandria. The one that is most important for us is the Alexandria that he will found in Egypt as a new harbor for trading from Egypt. And that's going to become, that'll surpass Athens and Syracuse as the greatest ancient city in the Mediterranean. So Alexandria is going to be a very important place. Alexandria in Egypt. Other ones will be either small or medium or not even survive. But we have these little Greek colonies scattered around to rule, but he's dead and there's no heir, so what do? We go to the next slide. Right, and what happens is Alexander's generals will fight among themselves in a series of wars, which I won't go into detail, a whole series of civil wars where Alexander's generals fight to basically take territory and create their own kingdoms. And this is where we get what we call the Hellenistic kingdoms. And here's where we'll talk about Hellenism. Hellene, right, the root word, Hellene, basically means Greek. It's the Greek word for Greece. We use Greek, but they use Hellene, right? And what we use it for is the expansion of the Greek culture and Greek language outside of Greece. So Hellenism is this expansion of all that Greek civilization around the Middle East and Egypt. And so when we talk about Hellenism, it's this new culture that's outside Greece and these new political kingdoms, because the Greeks will always be a small minority ruling these territories. So not only are they bringing Greek culture to this area and influencing it heavily, but they will be in turn influenced by the majority populations that they are ruling over. And so Hellenism will be a evolution of Greek culture. And I think it's fascinating, isn't it? We talked about how the Greeks first got their culture from the Middle East through the Phoenicians, art and literature and so forth, but then developed their own version, and now they export that version back to the Middle East, which influences the Middle East, but also the contact goes back and forth. So it's very complex. It's very hard to call something a pure culture because there's always back and forth influences and movements. The three main kingdoms that I've got on my map here are the kingdom of Antigonus, which is roughly Greece and Macedonia. The general Antigonus will hold control of that. Seleucus will control a big chunk of what is now Iraq and Syria in the heart of the Middle East. And a general named Ptolemy, who will actually take Alexander's body, take it to Alexandria in Egypt, and bury him there, and become accepted by the Egyptians as their new pharaoh. So the Ptolemaic kingdom is in Egypt, essentially, sometimes expanding a little out. So there are others. Some of them break away, like Persia in Iran. That breaks away entirely from the Greeks. It's just too far east, too big, and you get once again an independent Persian sort of kingdom. But the core of the Middle East is these various kingdoms with these Greeks ruling over these huge native populations in these Hellenistic kingdoms. Greek will always be the language of the rulers and education. So what does that mean? Like I said, things influence each other. The key thing, and I don't have it here, I want to talk about citizenship. Should be on the slide, but it is not. There's a word that we're going to evolve in the Hellenistic period, now that the Greeks are scattered all over, or Greek rulers are scattered all over, of what's called cosmopolitan or cosmopolitanism. Cosmo, world, polis, city. So the world is a polis. Right? Really, the Greek world is a polis, rather than just little Thebes or little Athens. The Greek world is a polis, is a city-state. And as a cosmopolitan, you are considered a citizen of the world. So citizenship as a concept, even though it's not a political thing, you're not a citizen of the cosmos, officially, politically. You're still a citizen of Athens and maybe a citizen of the Antigonic kingdom. But the concept is that there's this idea of the Greeks, the Hellenes all over, and a cosmopolitan person is a person who sees the universality of Greek civilization. A cosmopolitan person is broader than his small little political entity. So the sort of big thinking. So that's that concept. And what I'll do is the next slide, and we can look then at a little bit of the culture and so forth. We're going to expand learning and knowledge. And one of the things that happens is Alexandria in Egypt, like I said, becoming a great trading city, also becomes a center of learning. The Ptolemies, that dynasty, will create one of the great library of Alexandria, which is connected to a university. And it will become the biggest library in the pre-modern period, and a great center of learning. And they will pick up from the Egyptians, who are tremendous builders, as one imagines, from pyramids and other structures, some very advanced mathematical techniques. So they're going to be doing all sorts of learning and study and so forth. But Alexandria will become a place where mathematics really, picked up from the Egyptians, really moves forward. And you have people, you see them on the slide, like Euclid, who's basically going to take all these different ideas of measuring angles and triangles and things and create essentially a formal mathematical field of geometry, Euclidean geometry. And he's a Greek in Alexandria, creating essentially geometry from a whole bunch of other different bits scattered around. And then using geometry, a later scholar named Eratosthenes, who's actually going to be, Euclid's around 300 BC, Eratosthenes maybe closer to 200 BC. Eratosthenes is going to use methods of geometry. What you do is you put two sticks, one in, say, in the ground in Alexandria, and then you go to another city a few hundred miles away, and put a stick in the ground there, and you have observers. And then what you're doing is you're observing the shadow angle based on the sun. When the sun is in the sky at noon, you can do the angle of the shadow. It's not precisely overhead unless you're the equator. And what they can look at is the difference of the angle of the shadow tells you the difference of the angle of the circle that you're in. And then you can know these two cities are this far apart, they're on this part of the angle of a circle, and then Eratosthenes can then calculate the diameter, or circumference, of the Earth based on these little measurements. Okay, what is the angle between here? And he pretty accurately calculates the circumference of the Earth is something close to 25,000 miles. And that's pretty much accepted science, and will be till the present period. So fascinating advances coming out of Alexandria. Again, the encounter of the Greek logic and philosophy with Egyptian mathematics, and coming up with all this. There are new philosophies. I won't go into massive detail on them. I've got the most popular ones linked there, but what these tend to be is they're less a attempt at understanding the big picture, right? Plato and Aristotle wanted to understand the big picture. Are there ideals or is it realism? How does everything work? In this new world, this Hellenistic world, these bustling kingdoms and trade and Greeks moving around and so forth, perhaps it's a more materialistic world, I don't know. But these are philosophies on how to live a good life. Less on how to understand the epistemology and metaphysics of how the world works, but on what is a good life, right? How does one live a happy and good life? So it's about how to live in many ways. They have some sort of concepts of how the universe works and so forth, but the focus is on how to live, how to have a good life. Which is sort of an interesting change. I think you start maybe the early philosophers thinking the big questions, and then as you go on, like, well, how do we apply this, right? What does it mean for us? So really interesting views on living the good life. And it doesn't mean living it up and partying. This is sort of a Hellenism's, I find interesting. The philosophies are very fascinating ways of how to live. We're advancing in knowledge, like in mathematics and other things, and it's a very vibrant time, at least for the Greeks who are in control of things. But the Greeks, and I'm going to go to the last slide now, the very last slide. The Greeks, right? Yeah, influenced, I said, and influencing. And one of the things that's going to happen is they are influenced by the Middle Eastern sort of viewpoints, and some people in the Middle East will be influenced by the Greek philosophy and learning. One of the things we will see, and I'll go into this more later when we look at the Roman period and Christianity, but the Hebrews, this group of tribes, or sometimes a couple of small kingdoms, just right next to Egypt, they tend to just change hands. Whoever's the great power at the time is in charge. Persians, they're part of the Persian Empire. When Alexander moves through, they surrender and becomes part of usually either the Seleucus' empire or Ptolemy's. But these are ruled by Greeks at this time. And Greek becomes the language of learning from anybody in the Middle East, including the Hebrews. And what they get is they translate their holy book, what Christians call the Old Testament, into Greek. It's called the Septuagint. So there's a Greek translation of it. And the very last groups of books written in the Old Testament are in Greek. Now, some Christian denominations refuse to accept those as legitimate biblical works. Some do. But the Hebrews are being influenced by Greek. They're using the language and they're being influenced by the Greek philosophy and thinking, which we'll get into when we get into early Christianity and look at how Greek some of that is. And one way of looking at it for the Greeks and others is this Neoplatonism. It's going to be very influential again on Christians. Remember, Plato saw that there were perfect ideals that we strove to understand and meet. Well, Neoplatonism, if you have one God, like the Hebrews and later Christians have one God, that God becomes the ideal. So Plato's idea of perfection is in this God, in the mind of this God, who you try to understand. That's Neoplatonism. It's basically using Platonist thinking to understand God. And one thing that'll come from the Greeks to the from the Middle East to the Greeks are mystery cults. These are religious groups where you pick a particular god or goddess. They're not monotheistic. They're still polytheistic, believe in multiple, but they will very specifically dedicate their lives to one particular god or goddess. And a mystery means knowledge. It's an old English word. We've changed the meaning, but the old meaning means knowledge. And so by following this god, you might be baptized into, and again, cult just means a sect or group following a particular god. It's not a negative term. You join this group, you go through some form of baptism, then you learn the mystery, the knowledge that this god or goddess gives you, this advice on how to live a good life and how to have a better afterlife. And you sort of follow their rules and the rituals of this group. And these become very popular. The Middle Eastern, they become very popular with the Greeks. And I'm kind of pointing that out because what we'll see is with early Christianity, with this, you follow Yahweh, you're baptized into Christianity to follow God, and then you follow God's rules and laws to be saved. It's very similar to a mystery cult, and so easily accepted by the Hellenistic civilization. So we have the Greeks invading, conquering the Middle East, bringing Greek thinking, culture, philosophy, science, political institutions such as citizenship, but also being influenced by the Middle Eastern knowledge from mathematics to ways of doing religion. So it's a very complex mixing pot of things changing. It's a fascinating period. And of course, multiple kingdoms, no big empire anymore. The Persian Empire is gone. So it's a very, very complicated, fascinating period, which I've not given justice to in this short thing. But that's what we'll get. We're going to leave week one with a very expanded, complicated, interesting Mediterranean world. So when we get to week two, we'll see the Romans sort of begin to engage with that Greek world.